Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy. This is Unit 6, Lecture 1 on the Philosophy of Religion, where we're going to be tackling the question, does God exist? Your reading for this intro lecture is, like a lot of the others, the intro out of the textbook, is Belief in God Rationally Justified, Arguments for the Existence of God. So, like a lot of the other intro lessons, studies, whatever you want to call these, introductory lectures, the plan of attack is to sort of do an overview and purpose of the philosophy of religion, some of its problems, the big puzzles that we look at. But then, unlike a lot of our others, I want to remind us and clarify, how this course is going to approach the topic, how we're going to be studying it, and make sure that we're all exactly clear on what the expectations of you are, and how I'm going to end up handling what's, oftentimes a very sensitive subject for a lot of folks. Then we're going to do an overview of what types of arguments for the existence of God there are, and how they map onto our readings as we go forward, letting us have a clear idea of where this unit in the class is going to go. So, I'm not going to tell you a story this time around. I tried to think of something rather amusing or puzzling or interesting to sort of illustrate the problem. But honestly, you guys probably have enough life experience with things to not really need one of those for this question. See, so far in this class, we've been tackling a lot of the big, deep questions of life. The uniquely human things that we end up asking ourselves at 3 a.m., when we're just chatting with roommates or something like that. We've talked about morality, we've talked about what sort of thing the self is, we've talked about freedom, we've talked about knowledge and belief. We've talked about a lot of really big and deep subjects that maybe you've not thought about before, but at least you're familiar with the kind of question. Well, in this unit, we're going to tackle something that chances are you've at least thought briefly about, if only because of news stories or other people. This is probably the biggest question that you could tackle as far as investigating the big questions. All of the others are deep, fundamental aspects of human life. What is morality? What kind of a thing am I? Am I free to make my own choices? What sort of things do I have justification in knowing? These are big, deep, fundamental human questions. They're the sorts of things that sort of define what we are and how we engage with the world. And in that sense, I don't want to diminish the importance of the weight of any of those. But what if there was a question whose answer influenced all of those? A question whose answer influenced almost everything? Whichever way the answer to this question goes, it just changes the way that we see every aspect of life. That question would be probably one of the most important and most worthwhile of study that anyone could give. And in this case, the question of whether or not God exists is one of those questions. It's something that almost every human being has wondered at some point or another in their life and in the history of civilization. Perhaps not in those terms or not in that same way, but the question of whether or not there's something out there, something bigger than us, something fundamental to the universe. Well, that's awfully vague, but the idea is there is a big, deep, immense question worth studying and focusing on here, and we're going to spend a little bit of time the next couple of weeks looking at this question and the history of how some of the most intelligent people on the planet have gone about studying it. Now, some of you might be wondering why the existence of God is something that we're going to study in a philosophy class at a public, state-funded university. Isn't that a religious question? Why are we studying this in an actual class as opposed to your own church or whatever religious tradition you might belong to or not belong to? Something you might think about just in your own time. Well, if you remember back to Unit 1, we defined philosophy and the purpose of philosophy, its role as an academic branch of study, as the study and investigation of the fundamental principles of things, including the fundamental principles of the world. And that means that we need to figure out, as philosophers, we need to figure out the basic nature of the world. That is, how the world is structured, what its fundamental concepts and origins and causes and the rest are. And as part of that, we need to consider whether or not the divine exists. You don't get much more fundamental than that. You see, if there is such a being as God, then that existence is going to influence and tweak all of our other theories and all of the other fields of study. We have to suddenly ask ourselves, presuming that God exists, how does that affect ethics? How does that affect our freedom? How does that affect the nature of human beings, the origins of the universe, the nature of physical laws? The existence of God is something whose truth or falsity is going to influence almost everything else you could possibly study. Sure, you could do some studies in isolation. Physics will do just fine whether or not God exists. Biology will do just fine whether or not God exists. But that's because those are intentionally narrow fields. They define clearly what areas of study they focus on, like, say, the nature of the relation between matter and energy, or the interaction of building blocks of matter, of living things. Because they intentionally limit and focus their study, they would do pretty much fine whether or not God exists, which is usually why, for scientists, this type of question is totally irrelevant. It doesn't change whether or not a certain acid interacts with another compound in a certain way, or doesn't influence the behavior of zebras in any deep or important sense. But for philosophers, our stuff starts changing quite a lot. Imagine if our first unit had been on the existence of God, and you might have been convinced that God exists or doesn't exist. All of a sudden, you start viewing everything else we studied through that lens and start wondering, how do these things interact? Because they just do. So in a sense, this is the most fundamental question that we could study. So, being a fundamental question, an investigation of fundamental principles, even though it may feel a little bit weird, it very much belongs in this class. Now, that being said, philosophy is not theology. This is not a religious endeavor at all. And rather than working within any particular religious tradition, including starting from default atheism, philosophy approaches this subject, this question, in very general and abstract terms. Religious texts, traditions, teachings, mystic experience, these things usually play minor or entirely non-existent roles in the philosophy of religion. Instead, we, as philosophers, will approach this subject exactly the same as we do any of the other questions we look at, by focusing on arguments, on reasons, and trying to make sense of different proposals and theories and that sort of thing. Now, all that being said, before we get into analyzing arguments for and against the existence of God, I want to make a few things clear about the way this course is going to handle the subject. Because for a lot of people, this is a very sensitive topic, in the sense that this is something that a lot of people aren't comfortable discussing publicly. It's something that they really don't like reading opposite views about. And unfortunately, popular media has done nothing to help with this. Debates on the nature of religion, of the relation between religious communities and the rest of society, they've kind of played up the conflict a lot. So emotions are generally pretty high when we investigate this subject. So, with that being said, I want to make certain things clear about how I, as your instructor, and the class as a whole is going to approach all this. So, a lot of these things have been said before, but I want to make sure that we're clear on them. I want to restate them and make them as explicit as possible. First and foremost above anything else, in this class, you will never be graded, counted off, penalized, or otherwise judged for your beliefs or position on a given subject, including, especially, this one. Your grades in this unit, and in every unit and for the class as a whole, depend only on a handful of things. Whether or not you can demonstrate that you understood the material, that you've thought about it deeply and critically, and can give clear reasoning for whatever position you choose on a subject. So if you don't agree with me on a particular question, I don't care. In fact, I would 110% welcome disagreement. For one, you'll probably never know what my actual position on these sorts of things are, because I just probably won't talk about them. But as a matter of policy, you will never be graded or penalized for the position that you hold. Maybe for the reasons why you think it, in the sense that they may not be clear, they may not be expressed correctly, there may be a fault in the logic that can be demonstrably, objectively proven. but for the position itself, for your beliefs, you will never be penalized. As part of that, as far as this class goes, I am not trying and will never try to actually change your beliefs on a given subject. This class is not going to be working to undermine your convictions and trying to convert you to some other position. Honestly, I don't care what religious tradition you belong to. You could be atheist, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, Baha'i. You could be a non-theist, as-a-true pagan who operates through a particular metaphoric and literal lens to better understand the interconnected web of existence, and I really just don't care about that. My goal is not to change or influence your personal beliefs and positions. I'll just be frank about it. Contrary to the sort of image of philosophy given in movies like God's Not Dead and that sort of thing, our goal here is not to make everyone atheists or, for those who don't believe in religion, our goal is not to convert you to some tradition that you don't already believe in. Instead, my goals in this unit and in this entire class are threefold. That is, there are 3 goals that I'm going to try and accomplish with this unit and with all the others. Even if I've not always made these explicit, I think I did somewhat in the first unit. But this is my purpose in everything that we study. 1, to make you familiar with the most significant and influential historical arguments for a given position. In our case, for this unit, arguments for and against the existence of God. 2, my second goal, is to continue developing your critical thinking skills using these arguments as master studies, the way that I talked about in the first unit. That means that we're going to study and work through these arguments so you can better understand their reasoning, then the way that they go about things, so that it can improve your own critical thinking skills. By studying and mimicking the methods of very brilliant people on both sides of an issue, you'll help learn better ways to approach and think about a topic. And as part of all this, to help, not force you to quote-unquote earn your beliefs by fulfilling the above 2 goals. Now that's an odd sort of phrase and I want to clarify it. By earn your beliefs, what I mean is that I want to help you critically analyze, discover, and develop the reasons for your beliefs, whatever they may be. I don't care about your particular position, but I want you to have arrived at that position because of reasons. I want you to have thought about whatever position that you want to believe or agree with. So, regardless of what position you hold, I want you to have thought about it. I want you to have reasons for it. And yes, there are good reasons for both sides of this issue. You may not think so at the moment, but hopefully as we go through this study, you'll start to realize that even if you don't agree with something or a particular position, there are good reasons for thinking it. You may not find those reasons convincing. You may not find them good enough, but they are good. They are well thought out. They are well intentioned and sincere. So, my goals, just to make it clear, not to convert you to any other position. In fact, I'll try and cover all of this stuff as neutrally and without bias as possible. But I want to make you aware of the historical stuff. I want to improve your critical thinking by studying that historical stuff, and to help you analyze and develop your own beliefs using critical thinking and just plain clear thinking. Oh, shoot, that just jumped towards the end. Alrighty, back to where we should be. So, all of this stuff as far as policy means, unfortunately, that you will read, study, and think about positions that you disagree with. There's a reason why I've been warming up to all this. It's pretty much guaranteed that you will disagree with something that we read in this subject. Even if you've not given any of this any thought before, we're going to be reading things that are at polar opposites as far as, I believe X, I believe not X. We're going to be reading something that you disagree with. And unfortunately, you're just going to have to deal with that. It's going to be hard for some of you. Some of you may find it perfectly easy. A lot of you may enjoy it. I usually do. But for some of you, this may be emotionally or personally difficult because this is, involving beliefs and subject matter that's so near and dear to our hearts. That being said, you're still going to have to do it. I'm not making any exceptions for, I shouldn't be, I can't read this, I can't study this. You can study it, you can read it, you can engage with it. I'm not asking you to believe it or to say that it's wonderful or anything like that. I'm not going to force you to do anything against any of your beliefs. But you will have to at least be aware of other things. Broadening your horizons is part of what getting an education is. So it's just part and parcel of all this. I'm sorry if it's difficult at some point. I'm here to help as much as I can, to make what accommodations I can. And if you just want to talk through something, remember that I'm always available for things. I may be slow at getting back to email, but I promise I will get back to you, even if it's indirectly answering concerns through a group announcement or for much more private and personal things. I'll get back to you directly as soon and as well as I can. Additionally, pursuing all of this, to try and make this as easy as possible and make it as fair as possible, I'll present everything we study as neutrally as possible. Again, you should know this sort of thing about me by this point in the semester, but I like to present both sides of an issue so that you're aware of things and can make up your own mind. Again, I very much value different opinions on things, so I'm never going to try and convince you of one side versus another. Now, I may point out there are certain strengths or weaknesses in given positions, and these things, may sometimes be my own personal opinion. But usually they're well recognized historically or conventionally accepted. This argument has a problem, or this position has this weakness. You may think that it's true regardless, but I'm going to point out strengths and weaknesses of both sides. Again, just like I do any other subject we study. And like every other subject we study, I expect you guys to engage with and approach this question and this material to the best of your abilities, with a certain amount of diligence, respect, and a focus on the material rather than, outside considerations, just as you would and have done with every other subject we've studied. So that means, don't go off insulting authors based on what position you think they have. I want you to actually engage with the arguments and the reasons given in particular readings. And remember, in the end, this sort of thing is good for you, no matter what you believe. If you have religious faith of some type, well, analyzing and critically thinking about that is a wonderful way to deepen that faith, to better understand why you believe the things that you do. If you don't have any sort of religious belief, well, critically thinking about it helps you better understand the way that religious thinkers do engage with the world, helps you to better empathize and understand with them, and analyzing things on your own end will help, as always, perpetually refining and making sure that you're pursuing the truth in a given matter. So no matter what you think, no matter what you believe, refining and critically thinking about things is a wonderful process to go through. It helps you understand both sides, it helps reinforce your own positions, by helping you always make sure you're looking towards the truth, no matter what that truth may be. So, all this fun, dry, policy and disclaimer stuff said, let's move on to the actual material. If you still have some questions or concerns about the way we're going to approach things, or the way that I'm handling things, or just about the material in general, feel free to contact me. Again, I may be slow at it, I may take a little bit to get back to you, but get back to you, I will. I promise I always read and follow up with your stuff. Okay, the material. Fun stuff. So, thus far in the class, we've been studying various branches and pieces of philosophy. We've looked at subjects from ethics, that is the study of morality. We've looked at things in metaphysics, that is the investigation of the fundamental principles of the universe and of the world. We've looked at questions of knowledge and belief, and we've dabbled a little bit in assorted other things. This unit, we're going back to the assorted other things. The philosophy of religion doesn't really fit well into any of the other three categories. So, what we're going to do is will end up being, or rather the philosophy of religion is, usually a mix of these other things. And by philosophy of religion, I explicitly mean the philosophical study of the fundamental aspects of religion and religious subjects, that is, the questions and things that religions engage with. So that means that the philosophy of religion, or the phil of religion, I sometimes abbreviate it on the screen, delves into questions such as the existence and characteristics of God, whether belief in the divine is rational, what religion is, what the implications of religious claims are, Like say for example, if God is all-knowing and exists eternally, how does that affect our free will? Some aspects of philosophy of religion look into specific issues of specific religions, like say justifications of the doctrine of transubstantiation, or does the Trinity make sense, or does this particular liturgical tradition, what is this doing, what sort of experience is this giving? The philosophy of religion delves into all these and a whole lot more. So it's therefore, like I said, a combination of several branches of philosophy, but all focused on one subject. That is, it does ethics, epistemology, metaphysics, and the like, mixed, depending on what question you're investigating, but it does it all by focusing these things on religion. And there are similar other types of branches of philosophy that study other subjects. For example, there's a philosophy of the mathematics, which studies things like, are numbers real, or are they just convenient shorthanded fictions that humans create? There is a philosophy of science that I've referenced a couple of times, trying to figure out what science is, what methods are valid, what should we be doing when we're doing science, or things like protons and other theoretical entities just shorthand, or are they real? There's a philosophy of mind that we've delved a little bit into. There's a philosophy of gender, of war. There's philosophy of pop culture, and numerous other things. We sometimes say in philosophy, for any X, for any subject, there's a philosophy of that subject. Now, we're focusing on the philosophy of religion in this unit, and in particular, rather than focusing on the wide and varied things that you could study, we're just going to be looking at one very basic and fundamental question: whether God exists. What we've been leading up to this whole time. Now, out of all the different things that philosophy of religion does, this question, our question, is a metaphysical question. It's a question about the way the world really is. It's a question about the fundamental structure of the world. So, we're looking at whether or not God exists totally separate from any questions about belief or what you should believe or so on. We're not looking at the potential benefits of believing or not believing, or whether one should have faith or not. So pragmatic questions like Pascal's wager or that sort of thing, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, are the kinds of arguments that say that you should believe in God because there are certain benefits to it. It's a gamble of sorts that works out in your benefit. That type of thing we're not looking at. We're totally just going to be focusing on the question of, does God exist? Regardless of whether anyone is around to believe it or think about it or consider the question at all. So it's a metaphysical question, not one of belief or knowledge. Now, that being said, we need to further clarify our question somewhat. If we're talking about a metaphysical thing, about the nature of reality, we're asking about, does God exist? Well, just like when we ask, does anything exist, or what is anything, we need to clarify what that thing is. So, to avoid confusion, we, and for the most part our authors, will use the term God to refer to a being that is omnipotent, that is all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, and omnibenevolent, that is perfectly good. For short, because that's a heck of a list of things to name, I'll call this conjunction of qualities, the combination of all these, omnicompetence. So, for our purposes, as far as we're going to be discussing it, God is an omnicompetent being, that is an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good being. Now, some of you are probably already starting to think up some objections and think, well, hey, wait a minute, that's not what I think God is. Well, that's totally 100% fine. There are many other definitions of God, or the divine, or ultimate reality, or the object of ultimate concern, however you want to engage with this. And many different ways to define the qualities that we're talking about. So, really, we're looking at one very specific definition of God. And that's awfully limiting, but we kind of have to limit things somewhat. Because we're going to be engaging with some of the most famous and influential historical arguments for and against the existence of God, and we've got to use their definition. We've got to make sure we understand what they're talking about. And we have to have at least some clear definition so that we have something to work with. So it may be biased somewhat towards the Abrahamic, the Judeo-Christian, Islamic concept of God, which rules out a lot of very interesting Eastern religions, or non-traditional theistic religions, or non-theistic religions at all that still engage with sacred reality in some sense. But unfortunately, we just don't have the time to investigate all those sorts of things. So, for now, anyway, we're going to have this functional working definition of God, and I'm asking that you just kind of roll with me on this one. Now, to further do some pragmatic refining and limiting and that sort of thing, there are two, and only two, really, basic positions that you can take in response to our question: theism and atheism. Theism, again, for our purposes and as far as we care, a working definition of theism is that it's the position that an omnicompetent being exists. Atheism would be the negation of that fact, the position that an omnicompetent being does not exist. Technically, one could also be agnostic to our question, but really that just means that you don't know which of those two positions is true. Now again, these two labels are overly simplified, reductive sorts of things. To say that there's only two positions to this question is incredibly limiting. True. But in general, they do capture the majority of the basic possibilities here. No matter how you might want to redefine God, a lot of people are going to say that some form of a divine being exists, which means that they have some form of theism that they affirm and believe in. Likewise, a lot of people have varieties of positions saying that such a being does not exist, which are all various varieties of or refinements on atheism. You might say that such a being doesn't exist, but there are still similar qualities or explanations for acting in certain ways. Anyway, the point is that yes, this is a very limited way to talk about things, but it lets us function with all of this. It's a pragmatic and necessary step that we have to take. And again, it lets us engage with the historical stuff in a very productive and useful way. As far as mapping on our labels and other things, arguments for the existence of God are arguments for the theism position, and likewise for arguments against the existence of God being arguments for the atheism position, just to make the terminology clear and how all this links up. Now, there are two basic kinds of arguments that show up on this subject: a priori arguments and a posteriori arguments. And you might recognize some of these terms from our epistemology unit. And we're going to use these terms in exactly the same way that we did then. We just won't be talking about knowledge, we'll be talking about arguments. So, an a priori argument is going to be an argument based solely on reason. You don't need any empirical experience. A posteriori arguments will be based on experience. So just like you can have a priori knowledge or a posteriori knowledge, you can have a priori arguments and a posteriori arguments. And we're going to be looking at the pros and cons of one of each type of argument. That is, we're going to be looking at one a priori argument and one a posteriori argument. Now, the intro in your book mentions that the readings in it go over two a posteriori arguments. And technically there are a couple of different ones that you could engage with. But as far as I and a number of other scholars are concerned, the second type of a posteriori argument that they list in the reading, the one that we're not going to talk about so much in the unit, really is just a form of the one we do study. So don't feel too left out that we don't go into the stuff, all of the stuff listed in this intro reading of the textbook. I'm picking and choosing a little bit for time purposes, but also very intentionally given the subject matter. Now, to give some names to these kinds of things. The a posteriori argument that we're going to look at is called the cosmological argument. And the cosmological argument, and for the record, these arguments we look at are arguments for the existence of God. We'll also look at critiques of these arguments that say that they're not true and that sort of thing. We won't look at the explicit arguments against the existence of God just for time purposes. the arguments that will show weaknesses in the ones we study will have to do as far as arguments against in this case. Because usually they're kind of bundled up together anyway. But the a posteriori argument we're going to look at is called the cosmological argument. And it uses facts about the way the world is structured and organized, i.e. the cosmos, to argue for theism. To give the world's shortest version of the cosmological argument, you might say that because experience tells us the world is such and such a way, we have reason to think that God exists. And the folks that give these will be Thomas Aquinas and Richard Taylor. Both give versions or at least discuss these kinds of arguments. Thomas Aquinas is the Saint Thomas that some of you Catholics or religious scholar folks might be familiar with. His is probably the most famous one, but Richard Taylor gives us a very modern and easy to understand version of the argument. Now, the a priori argument we're going to look at is called the ontological argument. And this one has a little bit of a weirder name, but I promise it's not as complicated as it looks. An ontological argument is based only on concepts and definitions and doesn't reference anything else. So, for our subject, for our question, the ontological argument for the existence of God would say, because the concept of God is such and such a way, we have reason to think that God exists. In other words, it doesn't make reference to any evidence or things about the way the world is. It just says, because the definition of God is such and such a way, because it includes these things, or because it implies these other things, then we have to know that God exists. And you may already start being skeptical of that, probably with good reason, because this sort of argument has a lot of flaws to it. But there's a lot of really cool stuff going on, and we'll see how that works when we get onto it later. Saint Anselm of Canterbury, is the one who gives us the historical version of the ontological argument that we'll study. And one of his contemporaries is bundled into the same reading, who will give us a lot of the critiques of it. Now, strictly speaking, the names of these arguments are names of types of arguments. There are lots of different versions of the cosmological argument, and there are lots of different versions of the ontological argument. But since we're looking at the most famous versions, we can kind of treat these as unique things. So sometimes I might say, ontological arguments as if there's a lot of them, but for the most part we can refer to these as specific things. So Anselm's argument is technically a ontological argument, but since it's the most important one, since it's the most historically relevant one, we can also call it the ontological argument. So if we refer to one of these in particular, we're talking about the ones we're studying. Now, as far as the unit's structured, we'll start off with the cosmological arguments because they're some of the more popular ones, they're generally better received, and they've probably had a little bit more influence historically. And then, after studying both for and against those, the strengths and weaknesses of those kinds of arguments, then we'll move on to the more abstract ontological argument. And again, we'll see both for and against that kind of position. Now, if you would, as we move forward, remember to try and keep an open mind about this stuff as much as possible. Engage this just as you would any other unit. And it may help if you actually engage this sort of stuff as arguments saying, such and such gives us good reason to believe that, rather than such and such proves that, proves without any question of a doubt or that sort of thing. These are often called proofs for the existence of God or proofs against the existence of God, but a lot of these authors wouldn't actually consider them definitive proofs. You very rarely get that sort of thing outside of pure logic, the sort of stuff they teach in math classes or intro logic classes in this department. In fact, just as an example, Anselm himself didn't actually consider his ontological argument as a proof, but rather he thought of it more as a demonstration to show here's some good reason for thinking that God exists and that sort of thing. So that may help you to read and engage this stuff as we move forward, to think of it this way rather than definitive proofs one way or the other. At the very least, it might make it a little bit more human and relatable rather than just a strange, weird thing that philosophers do. Alright, all that being said, good luck. Let me know if you have any questions, and happy reading.